Point towards the...
Okay, got it. I'm going to try. Okay, I'm last. Yay. Okay, who's still alive? Who would like to turn to their neighbor and say hello? 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 Okay, who would like to turn to me and say hello? Hello? Hang in with me if you can, please. Okay. Okay, so getting real about civic tech. Now, this morning, fascinating. We've had heroic individuals. We've had organizations, how to survive. We've had movement within civic tech. What have we not had? Funding, kind of putting that in the order. Citizens, right? Where are the people that we are trying to benefit? Okay, so I want you to try and think back about what some of the civic tech is for. Oops, hang on a second. Far too ahead. Okay, so these look like pretty basic questions, but they're very, very important, and it is surprising how often people can't actually answer these questions when they're doing these kind of work. And getting really clear about this and what your vision is for citizens, how they relate to the state, how you want the state to relate to the citizens, what does success really look like? It's surprisingly hard. Okay? And who are you deciding? Are you deciding for all the citizens? Okay? You, the heroics? Or are the citizens deciding? How does that process happen? Does your approach really match that vision? Really? I mean, really? And what is the danger that you're actually going to make things worse? Okay, so these are difficult questions, especially at the end of today. Now, I'm going to put up a bunch of very jargony-looking words, but I want you to try and engage with them. This is just a way for you to think about your work and what you're trying to achieve, and to have conversations with other people about what you're trying to achieve. Okay? You can use other words, I don't care, but I want you to think really sort of about the axes for a start off, right? So obviously, are you trying to work for the public good? I'm presuming most people in the room are. So you're not just interested in your civic community, you're interested in the public good. Who are this public? And what does public good look like? Is that me making that noise? Okay. And also, when you're thinking about citizenship and citizen empowerment, what does that look like? Is that what you're trying to do, or are you only trying to work with a very tiny community of people? Okay. So first up, when I've looked at lots and lots and lots of projects and lots of research on projects, and this is one of my syntheses. Okay, a lot of projects are actually framed. You can call them functional, technical projects. They are technical fixes for lots of service delivery problems. So they're things like mapping holes in streets by getting citizen feedback, improving health systems by getting feedback about whether that health system is working well. The idea is you feed that back up to government magically responds, and the service is improved. Okay? Call that a functional or a technical approach. Okay? There's a huge number of assumptions in there. First of all, that government is actually listening. Okay? Most of these don't actually work. Okay? Because there's no politics in it. There's no power in it. Those people who weren't listening in the first place weren't listening for a reason, and you just giving them the information doesn't change that. So you need to understand what it is that would actually make the change and whether your approach is going to make any change. And often, they don't. But the bigger issue is, in this model, you're thinking of the citizens just as users. Okay? They're just a service user. Their job is to just give narrow information about whether that service that's already defined for them is working or not working. Now, don't get me wrong, these things are crucial, and they can be very important. Okay? For example, if I'm a woman in a very deprived area and I previously can't get access to water, this is fundamental. I'm not underplaying it at all. It's vital. But it is a particular definition of the way you're thinking of your citizen. This is providing info in your technical solution. Oops, what's happened to the formatting? But another level up in terms of citizen empowerment is to think of citizens in an instrumental way. In other words, the system is defined, but here the citizen gets to make bigger choices, really. So, for example, an election process is already set up, and you're trying to improve the extent to which people can vote, can make that choice about who's appointed. Or in a participatory budgeting process about the allocation of money. Okay? This is a step up in terms of empowerment. But the question is that still enough in terms of the way of what you're expecting the citizen to do, and whether that is actually going to bring about the change that you want? Another level up is to call something transformative. And by this, it means you're actually trying to change the rules of the game in terms of what democracy is, about the role of the citizen in it. Okay? So you've moved the citizen up from user through to chooser. Here, you're trying to make them a maker and shaper. Okay? They're not just passively receiving the system as it's laid out for them. They're actually involved in who's going to be involved in the decision-making? How are we going to reach that woman who's in the far-flung community? How are we going to reach those disabled people or not? How big a budget should we actually have a say over? Now, it looks obvious, but you'll see in lots of places people using this transformative word. We're going to change democracy. We're going to change the role of the citizen. But actually, they're just talking about that very small functional area. And they're limiting the role of the citizen. And the technology that they use sometimes unconsciously narrows it down, giving them very small areas of choice over what they can comment on, giving them only ways in which they can feed in information one way, displacing existing areas where citizens might meet face-to-face, might discuss, might contest. Okay? So the point is to be conscious about what it is you're framing and what you're doing to citizens and citizenship in that role. Now, all of those are in the public good citizen empowerment angle. But what you see often is that there's a lot of people involved in these things that sometimes have a completely different agenda. Okay? No matter what they put in the rhetoric, they actually have a no-change agenda. Okay? So they're using the process of seeming to consult, seeming to have these democratic platforms, but they're doing it implicitly, not explicitly, to game the process, to shut down the space for discourse, to appear to consult, but actually not to do so. And here, citizens are basically reduced to pawns and dupes. And again, are being sucked into processes that aren't actually adding anything to the real democratic heft of what we're trying to do. Is there any danger what you're doing is feeding that? Oops. And of course, at the worst extent, and we're seeing this increasingly, is the use of technology to reduce democracy and the empowerment of citizens. Active surveillance, active suppression, active distortion of public opinion. And we know now of cases where there is infiltration of civil society networks, explicitly using technology gifted or donated, for example, by others, to capture names of activists, and to use that to surveil those individuals. If you are at risk of doing that, you need to be super conscious of that risk when you're inviting people into a space. Okay? Now, as I say, I'm not saying any of these, well, I am saying the bottom half is bad, but in the top half, it's more that you are conscious of it and that when you're designing your approaches, they are in line with what you're trying to do. Okay? And you're trying to maximize, basically, whatever it is you're doing in terms of the vision of citizens. So what are some of the things that we've learned about these things? So despite the rhetoric, as I say, which usually claims huge transformative changes, most work is actually functional. But functional approaches almost never lead to transformative change. Okay? By that I mean, so a couple of things. Openness does not lead to accountability. Transparency does not lead to accountability. I know, heresy, right? Okay, but it doesn't. It's a necessary step only. It will not change, as far as we can tell, in most cases, the political will. The information alone does not change political will. I'm sorry, but this is what the research is showing. Okay? So what does change political will? I hate to tell you folks, but it's a lot of the old-fashioned stuff. You get people together. It was what people were saying in the earlier presentations. You educate them about their rights. You mobilize them collectively. You group them together. You support them through the hard times. You invest in the very, very long term. We know all this. Okay, but we seem to have had some kind of collective amnesia. Get real. It's what's necessary. So as I said, even functional approaches don't work, partly because some of the basics are bad. Some of the things we know. It takes time and money to go down and research who your target people really are, what they really care about, whether they trust the system and they trust your system enough to even bother getting engaged, that they trust the government enough to feed them information. Most cases they don't. And the other thing I really wanted to, oh, actually we'll come on to that in a minute. Okay, and don't let the funders push you into stuff you know doesn't work. I know it's easy for me to say, but if you know you need an initial long testing process, dig your heels in and insist on it. Otherwise, you're setting it up for failure. And frankly, I work in a lot of places with some of the poorest people. They don't have time to waste on badly designed processes when it's about feeding their families. This is not a zero-gain thing for them. It's an active loss. And if you get them involved in a process and it doesn't work, you're breeding cynicism. Okay? So I'm not saying don't take risks and don't get out there, but do the homework and fight the funders to pay you to do the homework that you need to do. Take huge care about the possible negative unintended consequences. My understanding at the moment is that still half the people on the planet are not online. Okay? Know your citizens. If they're not online, or if certain are not online, and they are depending on existing systems that break down, they can have serious consequences. So, for example, if you're in an urban area and you're disabled, and you are dependent on social services, and you're excluded from the system, but you know that you can go and have a face-to-face meeting with somebody in your neighborhood, they know you, it's not working for me, they respond. If you replace that with a digital system that doesn't work, that person is cut out of life essential services. I'm making a strong point to try and make the point. This is not, these things have consequences. You can be disenfranchised from a system that doesn't pay enough attention to who these citizens really are. As I already mentioned, you can frame feedback mechanisms. It all looks fine. It's like a drop-down menu, but it's prescribed. There's no open space for new ideas. It's all very polite, right? So if you're an angry citizen and you need to be raising more dissent, there's no space to do that. So you're tacitly controlling that space if you're not careful. So do what you can to make that space genuinely open in terms of new ideas, and big time, mix online and offline, online, offline, online, offline. It's not either or, it has to be both. And the ones that are more effective mix that very carefully. This atomization thing as well, again, if there's a danger that previously there was kind of collective strength, if you're poor and you're less powerful, your strength typically comes from numbers. If you help atomize people, by that I mean breaking them down into little individuals that feed in their voice separately, you're weakening that power. So think more about not just people in the tech community working together, which is great, but a genuinely broader, bigger collective action. How are you supporting that? So, when you look at the programs that have been most successful over time, it's definitely a very long-term relay race. It typically builds on existing social networks that are already out there, people who know the system and know how it works both politically and socially. There are intermediaries that help navigate their way through the system, connecting the different parts. And it takes a lot of time to keep building and reinforcing that over time. These are not things that most tech activists like to focus on. It is not something that most tech funders like to focus on. It is what works. Okay? So you really have to get out there and make that broader investment. And as I've said, be very, very conscious about the bottom left-hand side of that graph. Don't get used. Don't get used to legitimize what is clearly a closing of civic space. Rage against the closing of the space. If over here we're like, oh, we've got a little platform and the government seems to be listening to us, and they're meanwhile shutting down the press and shutting down civil society, you're being used. Okay, so take great care. And as I say, be very careful in the way that you use technology to gather names, to process information in a way that can be misused by others less positive than yourself. So, have a think. Is this relevant for you or not? Does it help you think about the way that you're doing your work, which citizens you are reaching, which citizens you are not reaching, what the consequences are for those you don't reach, and what the risks are in the way that you operate? Thank you very much.
Thank you for this food for thought, and we'll be having some actual food as well right after the Q&A. The most upvoted question is not a question, as you can see, but is a thank you for this important presentation, so thank you. But let's go to Anonymous, who's asking us, collective action is important, but shouldn't we also work toward strengthening individual voices as well? Is it a fool's errand?
I don't quite, again, it's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah.
We definitely need individual voices, and I was thinking about the presentation in the morning about lone wolves and so on. It is true that there is a kind of galvanizing force of individual voices. You know, there are some strong individuals who will particularly move things along, and the first movers who will stick their neck out. But when you're dealing particularly in spaces where the space is closing as well, and it's getting more, I just come back from Cambodia, where it's getting more and more dangerous, you definitely need that collective strength as well. Not just obviously for the pressure, but for the protection. You need the protection, especially over the long term. So I don't think it's either or. You want the voices as long as you can protect them. But that's what I mean. I've also seen some sort of things where people have invited citizens who are new to that arena to step up, but without adequate protection for them, if it's risky for them. Okay, so just think through the consequence. I'm all for galvanizing individual voices, and have done lots of work on women's voices in particular, but you also need to think through the protection and the collective voice as well.
It also depends on the context, obviously,
Totally.
because you said you're coming back from Cambodia, which is way different than Romania,
Yeah.
obviously. So any concrete examples of civic tech products that did more harm than good? Can you think of something right now?
Well, I'm not going to particularly name names because I think people have learned from it, but there was certainly a phase. I mean, I've also been in the game a long time. There was a phase when there was definitely a sense of we have this piece of technology, we're now going to apply it everywhere, you know, en masse, with very little assessment of what was already there, or whether it was a match, how to adapt it, and so on. And that did harm. It did harm, as I say, in terms of wasting people's time, for whom time is money and income. But I think it also undermined the credibility. There was very much, I just ask you to think, everyone in this room is definitely within a certain community. That's what I'm trying to get across. People outside don't think like you do, okay? And so you've got to, if you want civic tech, you've got to think how that civic group, those citizens outside, think of you. So when you do a project that's badly designed and maladapted, it makes it harder the next time. Okay, so you might think, oh, we tested that and it like that, you know, it failed fast and we all moved on. Yeah, but it has consequences for people. So I won't name particular ones, but I think you know the kind of replication approach that was used in lots of places.
It's okay to talk about failure. It's actually a good thing. So Tom is asking us if we can give an example on the other side of a project that has moved the rightward along this axis of citizen empowerment, the axis you were showing us.
Yeah, I mean, well, again, I think the important thing to take is the ones that have, well, here's another provocative statement because I'm seeing it increasingly. You see these funders have got a lot to answer for, in case you hadn't noticed, I think. And you'll see these kind of proposals where it's like, show me innovation, and the problem almost doesn't matter. As opposed to the other way around, where it's like, what's the problem? What's the best way to solve that problem? Okay? So the ones I think that work well are the ones where, as I was saying this morning, the shared agenda is clear, and then they're pulling in lots of the different networks that are already there. So as we heard this morning, the human rights community is pulled in, the civil society community is pulled in, the people in government who are your allies are identified, the media people are identified. You have this ecosystem of people, and then the tech is used in a way that solves problems that that tech can solve, but not problems that it can't solve. Okay, so it's thinking in terms of that system as a whole, and I know again that this is, as people were saying, a lot of people who in the hacker community don't want. They want to get in and build fast, but if you don't build into that ecosystem, it often doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't sustain for very long.
Should we have more social entrepreneurship with sustainable business models rather than more and more NGOs depending on funding in the space?
Depends on the context, is the simple answer. I mean, I think the simple answer is that there's a role for both, as long as you're clear what you're trying to do. In certain contexts, I think to reach certain of the most marginalized groups, you are going to need not a social enterprise model. You're going to need funding injected into that model. Where a social enterprise model can be generated and there's recurring funds, then go for it. I'm less about that. I'm more about what's the problem that you're trying to solve. And then there'll be lots of different horses for courses, as we say.
Do you think we should work more on do no harm policies and manifestos, or even open up more spaces where, as techies, we can talk of ethical implications?
Definitely.
Definitely.
In case you hadn't noticed. And I think people, you know, we'll talk more about the funding in the afternoon issues, but this ability to talk with genuine honesty about things that have gone wrong, risks, the limits of what can actually be achieved, it's utterly crucial, you know, and talking about the ethical implications of who gets involved in this process and who doesn't is really vital. When you're face-to-face with people who've been cut out of systems and can't get any money, I'm working on disability rights at the moment as well. It's their life. You know, they are cut off from services because they can't access that system. Within households, you know, we have this thing about, you know, they're on the internet and they have a device. If a woman in certain ethnic groups in a wheelchair or whatever, she has no access to that device. You're kidding yourself if you think she's using it. Or she's got free access. You've really got to go and figure out who it is that has access and what the implications are.
Let's take this one with the value. The work of engaging with citizens is very important, yet often the least well paid. How do we support a culture that values this skill and application of it?
Sorry. Change the entire social norm of society?
The simple answer.
Yeah. I mean, carers get paid the least in every society. But I know you guys have a chance to do something about all that, you know. It's really, I'm just repeating, take the civic bit seriously, okay, and go out there and talk to real people, and not just your friends, and not just your friends of friends, okay, but really get down there and find out who it is you think you're trying to benefit.
There was a question that I'm not seeing now, but I remember somebody was asking, why do we use the term citizen and not something more inclusive like residents, by the way?
Yes, that's a good point. I agree. It's only because it's a terminology that's been adopted.
Relating to the civic side, you wanted to emphasize more of the civic
Yeah, and also
side.
on the right side, it has certain connotations, but I agree.
Okay, so people still want names, and Mika is asking if we can name the 5 biggest sources of funding for civic tech and how their priorities warp or support the kinds of goals you talked about.
I'm not going to talk about that, but I will talk about something I'm going to talk about this afternoon, which is crucial, which is know thy funders, okay, and know the variety in thy funders, okay. So, for example, at the one end of the spectrum, you've got your big institutional funder, paid for by taxpayers' money, usually heavily prescribed in what they can do, both politically and in like how long they can invest for, how flexible they be. All the way down at the end of this spectrum, you've typically got foundation funding, often with living funders. They're willing to take risks. They might be able to invest much longer. They can ride the journey with you as you fail, as you come back, as you fail. You have a personal connection with the people in that foundation. And in between, there's a whole range. These are simplified, obviously, but you get the picture. Layer on that all the national politics, but we'll just put that aside. The point is, what are you trying to do in your objectives? Okay, some funders are a match for what you're trying to do, and some are not, and they will drag you down a path that will hurt badly. Okay, so you have to, you know, if you're doing the early design stuff and it's highly risky, you need foundation funding. If you want to replicate and you're pretty sure what you want to do, and it's stable enough to do it, go for the bilat funder. But don't think one kind of funder is another kind of funder. It will burn you. Okay.
Speaking of burning, Colombina is asking us, how do we fund that kind of work, indeed the most important work, when one of the strategies of dominant powers is to defund civil society? Any ideas on this one? I know, it's a hard one.
Everything that was said earlier about funding. Just to reiterate, it's definitely a long haul. Okay, it's not about the projects, it's the long haul. So I definitely just reinforce what was said this morning. You need a funding strategy. After that, it depends on the context. You know, it depends on whether you can get individuals to fund you or whether you can get institutions. But it's easy to say, but the more you can get a funder who will ride the journey with you, it's better to be smaller with a funder that matches your identity than to be bigger with a funder that doesn't, because it will come back and hurt later.
So we have 0 minutes left. This means we're going to take one more question, and I think I will let you choose one. If you can read the screen, can you?
How can funders better support civic tech groups to mitigate and navigate these risks? Be at that end, even big ones. I mean, frankly, in the UK at the moment, you know, there are always going to be these political extreme limits on what large bilateral funders can do. And we need to be aware of that, but we should still be pushing them. We have to be honest as much as we can in much safer spaces than this, to be honest, than a big meeting, about the reality of, if we don't speak truth to power, we definitely can't shift the funder, but we do need to be aware of their limits. But for those foundations that have the room for maneuver, it's all the stuff we know. They need to fund long-term, very long-term. They need to fund investment in social capital, which takes time. They need to ride the failures. They need to have personal, honest mechanisms of dialogue with their grantees. I do know some that do that, but frankly, the majority have got a long way to go.
So I think that's a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, lunch is imminent, I assure you.